I am 72 years old. The heavy, polished wooden door of the cardiology clinic clicked shut behind me, and I sat alone in the sterile examination room, staring blankly at my own hands resting on my knees. I was exhausted, carrying a deep, hollow fatigue that seemed to live permanently in my bones. For 8 brutal months, I had essentially waged a war of absolute starvation against my own cardiovascular system. I had systematically removed every single grain of salt from my diet, eating nothing but boiled, tasteless chicken, unseasoned vegetables, and plain oats, genuinely believing that complete deprivation was the only way to save my failing heart. Yet when Dr. Evans, the senior cardiologist who had been monitoring my case, finally walked into the room and clipped my blood test results to the illuminated board, his expression was not one of congratulations. He looked at my pale face, looked at the stubbornly high numbers on my chart, and told me in a quiet, serious voice that my extreme, punishing diet was actively making my condition worse. He told me that by blindly cutting out all sodium, without understanding the mechanics of how human cells actually communicate, I was stripping my internal engine of the electrical charge it needed to function. He ordered me to stop restricting the salt and to start fixing the broken biological scale I had completely ignored. We need to completely dismantle the dangerous, simplified myths we have been sold about how to feed a struggling heart. Over the next few minutes, we are going to pull apart the hidden physiological disaster of extreme sodium deprivation, the exact mechanical ratio that truly governs the pressure inside your arterial walls, and the 5 specific everyday foods I brought into my kitchen to naturally repair my electrical system and safely bring my numbers down. I am not a physician, and I am not giving you a license to eat recklessly. I am simply an older man who almost broke his own body by following half of the rules, completely blind to the other side of the equation. You do not want the first real warning to be an emergency, and you certainly do not want to be betrayed by the very sacrifices you thought were keeping you safe. For the vast majority of my adult life, I viewed blood pressure management as a simple, unyielding transaction of subtraction. When the numbers on the pharmacy machine started climbing into the red zone, reaching a terrifying 156/94, my immediate reaction was to eliminate the enemy. I grew up in Columbia, South Carolina, where the food was heavy, rich, and deeply seasoned. I walked away from all of it. I threw out the salt shaker. I stopped eating out with Gloria. I suffered through dinners that tasted like wet cardboard, convinced that every bland, joyless bite was a necessary penance for my past habits. But the profound paradox that haunted me every single morning was that my body was not healing. The blood pressure remained stubbornly high, refusing to dip into a safe range. Worse than the numbers, I felt a terrible, dizzying weakness every time I stood up from a chair. My legs felt like they were filled with wet sand, and a thick, heavy brain fog clouded my afternoons. I was subtracting the poison, but the engine was misfiring harder than ever. I could not understand how a man could sacrifice so much pleasure, exercise so much rigid discipline, and still be losing the battle inside his own chest. I spent decades of my life working in public transportation operations, right here in Charlotte, eventually supervising the dispatch center and managing the mechanical maintenance of our heavy city buses. Because of that rigorous environment, my mind naturally interprets problems through the unyielding laws of mechanics, fluid dynamics, and electrical systems. Those massive diesel buses require a tremendous amount of electrical power just to turn the engine over and keep the heavy hydraulic systems running. That power comes from massive commercial batteries, and every single mechanic knows that a battery operates on a strict, non-negotiable principle of polarity. You have a positive terminal and a negative terminal. The electrical current, the spark that literally breathes life into the dead iron of the engine, only exists because of the active balance and exchange between those two opposing sides. If a young, inexperienced mechanic decides to completely disconnect one terminal, thinking he is saving power, the entire system immediately dies. The engine will not turn over. The lights will not turn on. The machine becomes a 30,000-pound paperweight, not because it is broken, but because the electrical ratio has been completely destroyed. Our human cardiovascular system operates on an incredibly similar, delicate electrical balance. What Dr. Evans explained to me in that cold examination room, and what the simplified health magazines completely failed to mention, is that the human heart does not just pump blood. It fires an electrical signal with every single beat. That electrical signal is generated by a microscopic pump inside your cells, and that pump relies entirely on two specific minerals to create a spark: sodium and potassium. They are the positive and negative terminals of your biological battery. Sodium pulls fluid into the blood, and potassium pulls fluid out of the blood and relaxes the blood vessel walls. For decades, I had been obsessively focused on completely draining the sodium terminal, while my potassium terminal was practically empty. Because the ratio was so violently unbalanced, my body went into a state of physiological panic. Without enough potassium to signal the arteries to relax, my blood vessels stayed rigidly clamped down. Without enough sodium to maintain the basic electrical charge, my heart had to work twice as hard, beating with a frantic, exhausted rhythm just to keep me from passing out. I had destroyed the electrical conductivity of my own heart. The pressure rarely goes up alone. It goes up with the habits we ignore. I had been completely ignoring the heavy, unyielding requirement for biological balance. I know exactly what happens when a man forces his body into a state of extreme, unbalanced deprivation, because I watched a senior maintenance worker at the transit depot suffer the devastating consequences. His name was Henry, a quiet, serious man who took a hypertension diagnosis as a personal failure. Henry decided to go on a strict zero-sodium water fast. He stopped eating anything that came from a box, a can, or a restaurant. He drank gallons of distilled water and ate plain iceberg lettuce. He lost 15 pounds in a month, and he proudly told everyone in the break room that he was starving the disease out of his body. But Henry began to look gray, and his hands shook when he held his tools. One afternoon, while climbing down from the engine bay of a bus, the severe electrolyte imbalance in his blood caused his heart to misfire. The electrical signal simply failed to connect. He collapsed hard onto the concrete floor, suffering from a severe cardiac arrhythmia brought on entirely by extreme potassium and sodium depletion. He survived, but he spent a week in the intensive care unit, his body tethered to intravenous bags just to restore the basic electrical charge he had foolishly starved away. He did not collapse because he was weak. He collapsed because he fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of human survival. The terrifying reality of my own broken internal scale was finally laid out for me when I sat down at the kitchen table with my daughter Danielle, who works closely with clinical nutritionists. She opened my pantry, looked at the barren shelves of plain grains and unseasoned foods, and sighed. She told me that the human kidney is a brilliant, highly efficient filtration machine, but it requires the presence of heavy potassium to properly filter out excess sodium. If you do not consume enough potassium, your kidneys simply hold on to whatever sodium is left in your blood, artificially keeping your blood pressure high. The goal was never to eat zero salt. The goal was to flood the body with so much natural potassium that the internal scale tips, forcing the blood vessels to open wide and the kidneys to flush the system clean. Danielle told me I needed to stop fighting a war against salt and start building an absolute fortress of potassium. I did not go to the pharmacy and buy expensive, artificial electrolyte powders. The human body prefers to extract its power from real, structural sources. I completely rebuilt the foundation of my grocery list, integrating 5 specific, heavy, potassium-dense foods into my daily routine. These were not strange, exotic ingredients. They were simple, earthy foods that I had simply neglected for too long. The first structural change I made was bringing sweet potatoes back into my house. For years I had avoided them, thinking they were too heavy or too full of sugar. But a single large baked sweet potato contains a massive amount of natural potassium, far more than the standard banana. Gloria and I started baking them whole in the oven, eating them plain or with a light dusting of black pepper alongside our evening meals. They provided a deep, grounding energy, and they served as the heavy anchor for the new biological scale I was trying to build. The second food I introduced was the avocado. Growing up in the South, this was not a regular part of my diet, but Danielle explained that the smooth, heavy green fruit was essentially a biological powerhouse for vascular health. It is loaded with potassium and the specific type of healthy fat that actually lubricates the internal walls of the arteries. I started slicing half of an avocado onto my plate every single morning with my breakfast. It replaced the heavy processed butter I used to spread on my toast, providing a rich, satisfying texture that finally made my morning meals taste like actual food again, instead of a clinical punishment. The third crucial addition was dark, leafy spinach. I did not buy the canned version, which is boiled to death and packed in chemical preservatives. I bought large, fresh bags of it. Spinach is an incredibly efficient delivery system for potassium and magnesium, another critical mineral that signals the rigid muscles around the arteries to physically let go of their tension. Gloria learned to lightly sauté a massive handful of it in a pan with a single drop of olive oil and fresh garlic. The heat wilts the leaves down, allowing me to consume a massive volume of vascular relaxing minerals in just a few simple bites, alongside my chicken or fish. The fourth food I leaned on heavily was the humble white bean. When the weather in Charlotte turns cold and damp in the winter, there is nothing more comforting than a warm stew. White beans, like cannellini or great northern beans, carry an absolutely staggering potassium load. They are cheap, they store forever, and they are incredibly dense. I learned to buy them dry in large bags, soaking them overnight in plain water, entirely bypassing the dangerous sodium traps of the commercial canning industry. We cooked them slow and low, building thick, hearty soups that actually fill my stomach and flood my bloodstream with the exact elemental charge my heart needs to keep the rhythm steady. The fifth and final food was the simplest, a habit I adopted purely for its quiet, reliable consistency. I started eating one plain banana every single afternoon, right around 3 o'clock, when the fatigue of the day usually starts to settle in. It is not the most potassium-dense food on the list, but it is portable, easy to digest, and provides a steady, reliable drip of the mineral directly into the system. It became my daily, non-negotiable maintenance routine. Just a quiet moment on the porch or at the kitchen table, peeling a piece of fruit and giving my internal battery the positive charge it needed to finish the day without misfiring. The physical-mechanical difference inside my chest became absolutely staggering once I established this new foundation. By flooding my system with these 5 foods, I finally gave my body the mechanical leverage it needed to process the fluids in my blood. Because the massive influx of potassium was actively commanding my arteries to relax and my kidneys to flush, Dr. Evans told me I could finally stop the extreme starvation. I slowly, carefully reintroduced a small, sensible pinch of real, coarse sea salt to my meals. The food had flavor again. I could eat a sliced summer tomato from the garden with a tiny sprinkle of salt, and the tomato actually tasted like a tomato. But this time, because my potassium terminal was fully loaded, my body did not panic. The electrical grid was balanced. The spark was clean. A steady life builds a steadier body, and my rebuilt pantry became the absolute guardian of my internal stability. The biological relief was profound, undeniable, and easily measurable. Within 6 weeks of balancing the scale, the heavy, wet sand feeling in my legs completely vanished. The dizzy spells that used to drop me to one knee when I stood up from the couch faded into nothing. My brain felt sharp, clear, and focused in the afternoons. But the absolute confirmation came from the numbers. I used to dread the gray automated cuff, bracing myself for the terrifying high readings. But now, with my arteries fully supported by the right minerals, my morning numbers began to drop with a beautiful, consistent, steady rhythm. 140 down to 130, and eventually resting calmly at a perfectly stable 122/76. My heart was no longer fighting a desperate, losing battle against a starved electrical grid. The engine was finally running with the exact ratio of power it was designed to use. When my son Marcus came over to the house a few weeks ago to help me replace the heavy alternator on his car in my driveway, the difference was visibly apparent. It was a hot, unforgiving Carolina afternoon. Normally, leaning over the hood of a car and wrestling with heavy iron parts would leave me breathless and clutching my chest in discomfort. But my lines were clear and my battery was fully charged. I held the heavy alternator steady while Marcus aligned the mounting bolts, working seamlessly for 2 hours without ever losing my breath or feeling that old, terrifying tightness behind my ribs. Marcus wiped his hands on a shop rag, looked at me, and said I had more energy than I did 10 years ago. I told him the truth. I told him I had finally learned how to charge the battery instead of just draining the tank. Marcus is 43 years old, a consultant who eats out of boxes and bags, constantly oscillating between eating terrible food and going on extreme, punishing crash diets to compensate. I saw him looking at the engine block, realizing that his own extreme, unbalanced habits were actively destroying his internal machinery. Most people wait for a scare before they change. I had my scare in the cardiologist's office, and I was making sure my son understood the mechanics of his own body so he would never have to sit terrified and exhausted in a sterile room. Control begins with what you stop normalizing. I stopped normalizing the idea that health meant living in a constant state of miserable deprivation. When I sat on the crisp medical paper in Dr. Evans' office for my next quarterly checkup, the atmosphere was entirely different. I handed him my logbook, showing him the steady, unyielding drop in my daily numbers. The machine whirred its steady rhythm, and the final numbers flashed bright on the digital monitor. 120/74. Dr. Evans leaned back in his chair, took his glasses off, and gave me a look of profound, genuine respect. He told me that my electrical system was functioning perfectly, and that I had successfully rebuilt the structural integrity of my own heart. I did not boast. I just smiled at him. I did not tell him about the transit dispatch center, or the heavy diesel batteries, or the 5 foods lined up on my kitchen counter. I just told him I had finally learned how to balance the scale. I am not cured, and I do not pretend that the threat of cardiovascular decline has been magically erased from my future. Managing high blood pressure is a lifelong, unyielding commitment. It is a daily contract you must honor with your own biology. The danger is always waiting patiently for you to drop your guard and return to the arrogant, unbalanced habits of your past. But the suffocating terror of fighting a war against my own food is entirely gone. I am sitting on my back porch right now, watching the Carolina sun sink below the tree line. The house is perfectly quiet. Gloria is in the kitchen, pulling a tray of baked sweet potatoes out of the oven. The meal will be rich, it will be deeply satisfying, and it will be perfectly balanced. My chest is open. My breathing is deep and effortless. My heart is beating with a calm, unburdened, steady rhythm. The road ahead of us does not have to be a desperate, miserable fight, defined entirely by what we are forced to give up. It simply requires us to stop buying into the dangerous myths of absolute starvation, to take ownership of the electrical balance inside our own bodies, and to do the quiet, unglamorous work of protecting the only engine we will ever have.